Welcome to my channel. My name is Sofia Harper, and before we begin, I just want to say thank you for being here, for giving me your time and your attention, because this story is not easy to tell, but it is real, and it changed my life in ways I never expected. I am 32 years old. I work in corporate finance. I have always been the reliable one, the calm one, the one who handles things quietly without asking for praise. I grew up believing that love meant being useful, that if you solved problems, paid bills, stayed strong, and never complained, then you earned your place in the family. My parents taught me that without ever saying it out loud. My younger brother Daniel was different. He was the dreamer, the artist, the one who needed support and patience and understanding. When he failed, it was because the world was unfair. When I succeeded, it was because I was capable, and so I did not need anything. I absorbed that logic like air. I breathed it in every day and made it my identity. I paid for my own college, took student loans, worked 2 jobs, and when my parents struggled, when my father lost his job, when my mother cried about bills, I stepped in quietly. At first it was small amounts, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, then it became monthly, then it became expected rent, utilities, car insurance, groceries. Daniel needed help with his studio rent. Daniel needed help after another failed project. Daniel needed help after another breakup. I never kept score. I told myself family helps family, and one day, when I needed something, surely they would be there for me. Then I met Ethan. We met at a work event. He was warm, steady, kind, the kind of man who listened without trying to fix everything, the kind who noticed when I was tired before I said a word. He loved that I was strong, but he also encouraged me to rest. He proposed after 3 years on a quiet beach, just us. The ring was simple, beautiful, and I cried, not because of the ring, but because for the first time someone chose me without conditions. The wedding planning began, and it should have been joyful, but even then the old patterns followed. My parents could not contribute financially, which I understood, but what they could not do was stop asking me for more money. At the same time, the venue, deposit, the dress, the catering, and still the calls. Sophia, we are short this month. Sophia, Daniel needs help. Sophia, can you just cover it this once? Ethan noticed the strain. He never complained, but one night as we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by wedding brochures and spreadsheets, he asked me gently, "How much are you actually giving them?" I laughed it off, said it was temporary, said it would stop after the wedding, but when I finally added it all up, it scared me. Thousands every month for years. Money I had never seen again, money that was never acknowledged, money that came with no thank you, only expectation. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything collapsed, not slowly, not gently. It happened in one phone call. My parents called together, which should have warned me. My mother sounded calm, too calm. "Sophia, we need to talk. Your father has been thinking, and we feel this wedding is a mistake. Ethan does not fit our family values. They said he was distracting me from my responsibilities. They said I was changing, becoming selfish, distant, ungrateful." Then my father said something that split me open. He said, "How can you afford a wedding when we are struggling? How can you celebrate while your family suffers?" I tried to speak, tried to remind them that I was the reason they were not struggling, that I had been paying for everything for years. But my mother cut me off and said, "If you go through with this wedding, do not expect our support, emotionally or financially." I hung up shaking and called Ethan. I told him everything, and he was silent for a long time. Then he asked me a question that no one had ever asked me before. "What do you want, Sophia? Not what they want, not what you owe. What do you want?" And for the first time in my life, I did not know how to answer. The pressure mounted, calls, texts, guilt messages. My brother accused me of abandoning the family. My mother cried. My father threatened to cut ties. The night before the final payment was due, I sat on the floor in my dress, still in its bag, and I realized something devastating. They did not oppose the wedding because they feared for me. They opposed it because they feared losing access to me, to my money, to my obedience. And when I finally told them that I would no longer be sending monthly support, there was a long silence. And then my mother said, "Then you have made your choice." The next morning I woke up to messages, not asking if I was okay, not asking about the wedding, but asking when the transfer would go through. And that was the moment something in me broke quietly, completely. I canceled the wedding, not because I did not love Ethan, but because I needed to survive the emotional storm that had consumed my entire life. The venue was notified, guests were confused, rumors spread. My parents told everyone I had a breakdown, that I was unstable, that Ethan left me. They never told the truth, that the money stopped, and suddenly so did their affection. I sat alone in my apartment staring at my phone as messages poured in, and one text from my mother stood out above the rest. "You embarrassed us, but we still need the money for this month, and I realized then that this story was not about a wedding, it was about ownership, about how love had been replaced with transactions, and how the moment I stopped paying, I stopped being their daughter. And as I took a breath and looked around the quiet room where my future had just shattered, I did not yet know that this was only the beginning, that the worst and the most freeing moments of my life were still ahead. I moved through the weeks after the wedding cancellation like someone underwater. Everything sounded distant, muted, my phone never stopped buzzing, but I stopped answering texts from extended family, coworkers, even friends, because I did not have the language yet to explain what had happened without feeling like I was betraying my own blood. My parents took control of the narrative quickly. They always had a talent for that. In their version, I had panicked, cracked under pressure, abandoned a good man, and lost my way. My mother called relatives crying about how worried she was about my mental state. My father told anyone who would listen that stress had changed me, and Daniel posted vague messages online about loyalty and family and how success can make people forget where they came from. I saw all of it without responding because I was still trying to understand myself. Ethan reached out gently, consistently, never accusing, never pressuring, just checking and asking if I was safe, if I had eaten, if I needed anything, and every time his kindness made my chest ache because it reminded me of what I had stepped away from. But I knew if I stayed with him without first breaking free of my family, I would eventually drag him into the same endless cycle of guilt and obligation that had swallowed me whole. I needed to face this alone. The financial side unraveled faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, my parents called again, not to apologize, not to ask how I was, but because the rent was late. My father spoke sharply, irritated, as if I had forgotten an errand. He said, "Sophia, this has gone far enough. You have made your point. Now send the money so we can move on." And something in his tone flipped a switch inside me. I heard not concern, not love, but entitlement, and I surprised myself by saying calmly no. There was silence, and then rage. Accusations flew. "How dare you, after everything we sacrificed for you, after raising you, feeding you, giving you a home." I reminded him quietly that I had been paying their bills for 6 years, that I had delayed my own life, my savings, my peace, and he laughed, not kindly, and said, "That is what daughters do, that is your duty." And in that moment the illusion shattered completely. I told him I would not be sending money again, not this month, not ever, unless there was genuine change, accountability, respect. And the call ended with my mother sobbing and Daniel shouting in the background that I was selfish, heartless, and greedy. The next morning, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face red, eyes swollen. She walked past me without asking permission and sat down like she owned the place. She said, "Do you have any idea what you have done? The landlord is threatening eviction. Your father is humiliated. Daniel cannot focus on his work because of stress." And I stood there listening, feeling like a child again, except this time I did not shrink. I asked her a simple question: "Why did none of you ever ask if I was okay?" She looked at me confused, as if the concept had never occurred to her, and said, "Because you are strong, you always have been." And there it was, the truth. They did not see my strength as something to protect, they saw it as something to use. I told her to leave. She refused, so I opened the door and waited. She stared at me, shocked, then angry, then wounded, but eventually she walked out saying, "You will regret this," and for TH. First time her words did not control me. The fallout spread through the family fast. Invitations stopped, calls dried up, cousins unfollowed me online. I was quietly erased from group chats and traditions I had helped fund for years. Holidays, birthdays, weekend dinners, all gone, and it hurt more than I expected. Grief does not always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like emptiness, long quiet evenings where you realize no one is going to call and ask how your day was, and in those silences I started to hear my own thoughts clearly. For the first time I began therapy, something I had always postponed because it felt indulgent, unnecessary. My therapist listened as I described my childhood, the expectations, the favoritism, the money, and she said something that stayed with me: "You were not loved for who you were valued for what you provided, and that distinction matters more than people realize." Slowly, painfully, I began to untangle my identity from my usefulness. I stopped automatically offering help, stopped apologizing when I said no, stopped explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Financially, my life stabilized in a way it never had before. My savings grew, my anxiety eased, I slept through the night, I even started laughing again. Small moments, at first a joke at work, a walk in the park, sunlight on my face, and then something unexpected happened. 3 months after the cancellation, I received an email from the wedding venue apologizing for the rumors They had heard an offering to refund part of the deposit as a gesture of goodwill. It was not a large amount, but it felt symbolic, like a small piece of dignity returning to me around the S. Aim time. Ethan and I met for coffee. It was awkward at first, then easy, then honest. He told me he had loved me enough to let me go and that he was proud of me for choosing myself. I cried then, not from pain, but from relief, because for once someone had seen my struggle and respected it. We parted with a hug, not a promise, but a sense of peace. I did not go back to him, and he did not ask me to, but knowing that love like that existed changed something inside me. Meanwhile, my parents' world began to crack. Without my support, the eviction notice came, and they moved into a smaller place. Daniel had to take a part-time job and complained loudly about how unfair life was. My mother called once from a new number, leaving a voicemail saying, "We are suffering and you do nothing," and I deleted it without listening twice. I was not cruel, I was just done absorbing consequences that were never mine to carry. And as months passed, something else shifted. Family members who had quietly watched reached out. An aunt apologized for believing the lies. A cousin admitted she had always suspected something was wrong, but did not want to get involved. Their messages did not erase the pain, but they reminded me that truth has a way of surfacing even when buried under years of silence. And I began to understand that losing people who only loved a version of me that served them was not a loss, it was a clearing. And in that clearing I started to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self, piece by piece, boundary by boundary, breath by breath, without knowing yet that the biggest confrontation was still ahead, and that when it came it would force everything into the open in a way none of us could ignore. Time kept moving even when it felt like my life had paused, and with distance came clarity, but also consequences I had not predicted, because when you stop holding up a broken system, it does not quietly adjust, it collapses loudly. My parents' financial situation spiraled fast, and they blamed me publicly. My mother called relatives saying I had turned cold. My father told neighbors I had been manipulated by therapy. My brother said I had destroyed the family out of spite, and for a while their voices were louder than the truth. But something interesting happened. When money was no longer flowing, excuses stopped working. People began to ask questions, uncomfortable ones, about how two healthy adults had lived for years without stable income, about how a daughter managed to fund everything while being painted as selfish behind closed doors. Cracks formed, stories contradicted each other, and slowly the narrative they had built began to rot from the inside. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my uncle, my father's older brother, a man who had always stayed neutral, polite, distant. He asked if we could talk, and we met at a quiet cafe. He looked tired, older than I remembered, and he did not waste time. He said, "Your parents asked me for money." I asked why they could not manage on their own, and they told me you abandoned them. He paused, then said something did not sit right with me, and for the first time in years someone had questioned their version. He asked me gently how long I had been supporting them. When I told him the truth, his face hardened, not with anger at me, but with shock and shame. He said, "Sophia, do you know how that looks?" And I said, "Yes, and I have known for a long time." That conversation was the first domino. Once one person knew fully, others followed. My aunt demanded answers, cousins compared notes, stories unraveled, and suddenly, I was no longer the villain. I was the secret everyone had ignored. And when families are forced to confront uncomfortable truths, they often choose sides quietly. Without announcements, invitations stopped coming to my parents, calls went unanswered, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one being isolated. They were. The emotional shift was strange. I felt lighter, but also deeply sad, because part of me still wanted my parents to wake up, to apologize sincerely, to say, "We failed you," but they did not. Instead, they doubled down. My mother sent me a message filled with bitterness, saying, "You turned everyone against us." I replied only once, saying I told the truth, nothing more, nothing less, and then I blocked her again. The real turning point came 6 months later at a family gathering I had not planned to attend. My grandmother was ill, and the family gathered at her house. It was the first time I saw my parents since everything fell apart. The air was thick with tension. They looked smaller, somehow diminished, not just financially, but emotionally. My father avoided my eyes. My mother stared at me with a mix of resentment and fear, as if I were a stranger who had exposed her secrets. And then something unexpected happened. My grandmother took my hand. She was frail, her voice weak, but clear. She said, "I always wondered how they managed all these years," and no one answered. The room fell silent, and she continued, "I see now who carried the weight," and she squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you for taking care of everyone even when no one took care of you." That moment healed something deep inside me, because it was acknowledgement without Ishans without demands. My parents said nothing they could not, and in that silence their authority evaporated. After that day the dynamic changed completely. They stopped asking for money. Because there was no one left to pressure me into compliance, they stopped pretending. They had moral ground. My brother drifted away, embarrassed, angry, forced to face adulthood, without a safety net, and I watched from a distance, not with joy, not with revenge, but with a strange calm, because I had finally stepped out of the role assigned to me, and life began to open in unexpected ways. I took a solo trip, something I had never done before. I stood in a foreign city, anonymous, free, and for the first time, I was not responsible for anyone's survival. I was just a woman. Walking, breathing, choosing. I made new friends, people who knew nothing of my past, who liked me for my humor, my curiosity, my kindness, not my bank account. I learned to say no without guilt, yes, without fear. I redecorated my apartment slowly, intentionally. Every piece chosen by me for me, and one night months later, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I realized something profound. The wedding that never happened had saved my life, not because marriage was wrong, but because it forced the truth into the open. Before I repeated the same pattern with a new family, I would have kept giving until there was nothing left, and called it love. The cancellation was not an ending, it was a rupture, and through that rupture I escaped, and still there was one final reckoning waiting. Something I did not know would arrive in the form of a letter that would bring everything full circle and force me to decide once and for all what forgiveness really meant and whether some doors should remain closed forever. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that does not warn you it is about to reopen old wounds. It was handwritten, my father's name on the envelope, and my hands shook as I held it, because some part of me still remembered the man who used to walk me to school, who once carried me on his shoulders before the roles reversed, and I carried everyone else. I did not open it right away. I made tea, I sat by the window, I breathed, and when I finally read his words, they were careful, restrained, almost formal. He wrote that they were struggling more than they admitted, that pride had kept them silent, that losing the family support had been harder than expected. He wrote that my mother cried often, that my brother had moved away chasing work, and that the house they downsized to felt empty and cold. He wrote that they never intended to hurt me, that they believed I was strong enough to handle everything, and that maybe they had relied on that too much. He asked if we could talk, if I could find it in my heart to forgive and help again, and as I read, I felt a familiar pull, the old instinct to fix, to soothe, to rescue. But this time I noticed what was missing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harm, no understanding of why I had walked away, only discomfort at the consequences and a hope that I would restore the old balance by sacrificing myself again. I folded the letter and set it down, and I realized that forgiveness without accountability is not healing, it is erasure. And I had erased myself for long enough. I did not respond right away. Days passed, and in that time I spoke with my therapist, with friends, with myself. I thought about the little girl who learned to be quiet, to be useful, to be invisible in her own family. I thought about the woman who almost built a marriage on top of unresolved wounds, and I knew that responding did not mean returning. I wrote back carefully, honestly. I told my father that I wished them well, that I hoped they found stability and peace, but that I could not resume financial support, and that before any relationship could exist, there needed to be real acknowledgement of the past, not vague regret, not excuses, but understanding. I told him that love could not be conditional on what I provided, and that until that truth was faced, distance was necessary. I wished him health, and I meant it. Then I mailed the letter and felt something settle inside me, not closure exactly, but alignment. Months went by and life continued to grow in quiet ways. I advanced at work. I built friendships that felt mutual. I laughed more freely. I rested without guilt. My parents did not respond, and I accepted that not every story ends in reconciliation. Sometimes growth means walking forward without dragging the past behind you. And then one evening, a year after the wedding that never was, I received a message from my brother, short, uncertain. He said, I know I was wrong. I am sorry for what I said, for what I believed. I did not know how much you were carrying. I am trying to build my life now, and I hope one day we can talk. I read it slowly, and for the first time with him, I felt no anger, only caution and possibility. I replied simply saying, I am glad you are trying, and that was enough, because healing does not have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, incremental, respectful, and that was all I could offer. The anniversary of the cancelled wedding came and went without ceremony, but that night I lit a candle and reflected on the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I did not mourn the wedding anymore. I honored the awakening. I honored the version of me who finally chose herself. Not out of bitterness, but out of survival and growth. And now as I share this story with you, I want to be clear this is not about blaming parents or condemning family. It is about recognizing when love becomes transactional, when strength becomes exploitation, when silence becomes self-harm, and choosing to step out of that cycle even when it costs you relationships, even when it hurts, even when you are painted as the villain for protecting your peace. If you are listening to this, and you see yourself in any part of it, if you are the reliable one, the giver, the fixer, the one who never asks for help, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for saying no. You are not obligated to destroy yourself to keep others comfortable. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint people who benefit from your exhaustion. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Thank you for listening with an open heart. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter too. And until next time, take care of yourself because you are allowed to choose your own life. Welcome to healing. Welcome to freedom. And thank you for being here.